Welcome to the Kyl Center for Water Policy's webinar on tap water affordability. We're grateful that you were able to join us. The Kyl Center's Arizona Tap Water Affordability Project is co-sponsored by the Arizona Water Infrastructure Finance Authority and by the Arizona Water Innovation Initiative, a multi-year partnership with the state of Arizona that is led by ASU's Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory in collaboration with the Ira A. Fulton Schools of Engineering. I'm Catherine Sorensen. I'm the Director of the Research for the Kyl Center for Water Policy. I am joined by some amazing panelists today who you will get to know. Commissioner Marquez Peterson has been on the Arizona Corporation Commission since 2019. Ms. Peterson received her undergraduate degrees in marketing and entrepreneurship from the University of Arizona and an MBA from Pepperdine University. From 2009 through 2018, she was the CEO of the Tucson Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and the first Hispanic woman to hold statewide office in Arizona. She has also been recognized as the 2022 United States Hispanic Businesswomen of the Year by the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and was also recognized as a 2021 Most Influential Woman of the Year by Arizona Big Media. So welcome, Commissioner Marquez Peterson, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Blake Anderson is the president and founder of Mogollon Water Management. Mogollon Water Management offers comprehensive operations and maintenance services for water systems in the White Mountains here in Arizona. As founder, he leads a team of water professionals who are committed to providing safe and reliable, affordable water services in rural communities in Arizona. He has over 14 years of experience in the water industry and has a deep understanding of the challenges and opportunities of water systems in his area. Blake has certifications with the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality as a grade 4 water treatment operator, grade 4 water distribution operator, and is an operator certification committee member representing remote operations. He also serves as the Water Infrastructure and Finance Authority of Arizona on the Water Conservation Fund Grant Committee and represents systems under 500 service connections in that capacity. So a really interesting voice for our conversation today. Welcome, Blake.
Thank you. Appreciate having me.
Yeah, and then last but not least, we have Joe Olson. Mr. Olson has approximately 20 years of experience leading water utilities and is currently the general manager of Metro Water Domestic Water District in Tucson, where he is responsible for the daily operations of the utility. He is a registered professional engineer in Arizona. He has a BS in civil engineering from the University of Arizona, a master's in military operational art and science from Air University, and also holds a grade 4 ADEQ certification in water treatment, water distribution, wastewater treatment, and collections. Also, Mr. Olson retired as a lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Air Force after having served in both the active duty and reserve components. And he is a member of the Arizona Water Banking Authority. So, Joe, thank you for your service and welcome.
Thanks, Catherine.
We will start out today with a quick overview of our tap water affordability report. That will be led by Grant Heminger, who was the lead author on the report. Grant, off to you.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Like she said, hi, my name is Grant Heminger. I'm the lead author of the recently released Tap Water Affordability Study. I'm going to give a quick preview today of the study, what we measured, how we measured it, why we do it, and a quick look into some of the things that we found. I'll get us started here. So first, why study water affordability? Well, there are sort of 4 primary reasons that we want to look at this. Firstly, is to identify where, either geographically or perhaps categorically, where the risk of water insecurity is highest. It's important before there can ever be any kind of policy intervention that there's an understanding of where and how the issue is located. Secondly, we want to provide sort of the calculations and methodologies or what we call the frameworks to water providers so that they can do that analysis themselves, particularly in the third point, looking at when they're making rate decisions. When designing a water rate, it's more than just the amount. There are things like the rate structure and other parts of the water rate that are important to understand how it'll affect different households in your service area, especially in point 4 there. If there is a need for an infrastructure replacement or upgrade and a potential rate increase, it's important that there's an understanding of how to measure and how to analyze how changes in water rates will affect different households in your area. So how do we measure it? This study measures water affordability in community water systems in every part of the state of Arizona. So we measure at 4,000 gallons a month for monthly water costs, which is an amount that's generally adequate for indoor water use. So things like cooking, cleaning, drinking, but not necessarily for outdoor uses like pools or outdoor irrigation, which we're not looking for when measuring affordability. We ultimately ended up collecting that rate data for over 650 water systems that together represent report to represent somewhere on the order of 98% of Arizona's population. But once we have that, that only represents the cost of water. In order to make it a measure of water affordability, we then have to compare those costs to a very localized measure of income that we collect from the Census Bureau at the individual census tract level that is directly one-to-one tied to the community water systems that we measure. And we create those comparisons in one of two ways. The first way is sort of the most common way that it's done nationally. It's called the residential indicator, and that's where you represent water affordability as the percentage of monthly median household income for water costs. As you might be, as you might think, that doesn't exactly provide a holistic picture of affordability, and it might not provide a good insight into affordability for low-income households, which is why we also use and generally highlight in our results the household burden, which measures water costs as a percentage of 20th percentile income or lower quintile income. Those together, combined with the hours at minimum wage metric, which is exactly what it sounds like, provide a broad but still detailed and we think very accurate representation of affordability for an individual system or statistics at larger categories. So what did we find? Ultimately, we found that the state average water cost was around $41, which is about just over 2% at 4,000 gallons, I should say, which is just over 2% of that 20th percentile income figure, which, as you can see, is slightly higher than the national average. But critically, if you break that Arizona state average down into large and small systems, we can see the difference. And we can see that large systems, which together represent something like 94% of the state, are right on pace with national averages. But those large systems are generally above, both in terms of just the nominal rate as well as the percentage of income that they represent, which ultimately kind of balances out that overall state average. Maybe a different way to show this that could be informative is this, that there are, in the state of Arizona, far more people served by a water system that is more affordable than the national average, about 76% of people in a system that's more affordable than the national average, compared to about 24% in a system that is less affordable than the national average. However, there are far more systems that are in that less affordable than the national average category. So that you can see how that could affect some statewide reporting. When discussing these figures, it could be interesting and perhaps enlightening to use a different point of reference, something that's not just water cost to national water cost. So in part of the study, we do a brief exploration of water costs compared to a non-water good or to energy costs. And we found in our research that we did not do our own entire study of energy costs, but comparing Arizona water costs, our averages were generally much lower than national energy costs, especially in terms of percentage of monthly income spent. Whereas the majority of the data in Arizona falls between about 0.5% to around 5% in terms of monthly 20th percentile income. The national study that we cite finds that 20th percentile income is somewhere between 6 and 10% on energy costs. So it can just help put in context what water spending looks like in Arizona compared to other costs around the country. There's not time for all of it right now, but I encourage you all to really spend some time looking at to get into the study itself. There's some interesting statistical analysis for things like system ownership, rate structure, rate age, how affordability is relating to water quality, and many other things. So again, of course, I encourage you to take a look at the report itself. So what do we make of this? What do we make of these findings? Ultimately, our first finding was that surprisingly, most systems are actually able to raise rates. Somewhere on the order of 60 to 75% of systems in Arizona could theoretically raise their water rates and still stay below common definitions of affordability of about 2 to 3% of monthly 20th percentile income. So somewhere between 60 and 75% of these systems could raise their rates and stay below an affordability metric for their lowest income customers. However, ultimately that would result ideally in large increases in funding and the revenues for water utilities for things like infrastructure repairs and replacements. However, the systems that are most often in need of those replacements are generally small systems that, according to our data, are less likely to be able to raise rates and still maintain that affordability threshold. So to get together, those findings kind of emphasize and solidify a kind of well understood, or a now well understood idea that the real work moving forward, as you know, the cost of water, of providing water, continues to increase, infrastructure continues to age, rate increases are a natural result of that. When that is happening, that the work of water managers, who we're going to hear from in a moment here, is going to be striking that balance between revenue stability and infrastructure repair and replacement while still ensuring affordability for the lowest income customers. And we're confident that this report and this study can help water managers do just that. So with that, thank you, and I'll pass it off to Catherine and our panelists.
Panelists, are you guys ready?
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right, so let's start out with Commissioner Marquez Peterson. You regularly you regulate privately owned water systems across the state, which is a huge responsibility. What are you seeing out there in terms of their ability to provide reliable and affordable water service? What are the facts on the ground?
No, thank you for the question. And I'll kind of start out by explaining the commission just real quickly that we are a constitutionally created body. We're 5 members that are elected statewide, and we regulate electricity, water, gas, and wastewater, all in that private investor-owned area, as well as a number of other things. So in terms of the water utilities, we regulate more than 340 water utilities. That's quite a number of them. You know, grants data, I think, is very valuable because it ultimately, my message in this panel really was going to be about the balance that we face in making sure that our water utilities are making proper capital investments while we balance the affordability of our water utility rates and some of the challenges people face throughout the state in paying their bills. And it's great to hear the actual definition that he's defined in there. I wrote it down: 2 to 3% of monthly median income. I think that's a good track, something in which we're following very closely. The other thing that Grant mentioned, which resonated with me quite a bit, was small water utilities. It's absolutely what I hear as I travel around the state. It's the top thing a mayor or council member will speak to me about will be the challenge they're facing with the small water utility in their community. In fact, when I joined the commission in 2019, I held a workshop and found that we had more than 70 water utilities, small water utilities, that hadn't had a rate case in more than 20 years. And a lot of folks would think, great, no rate case, but ultimately that brings a lot of challenges, you know. So since that time, we've had about 20 of them or so have been acquired. We've had some emergency rate cases, which are absolutely not the direction we want to go. That means they haven't made the proper capital investment and face an emergency rate case, and there could be rate shock by consumers. So we're still, you know, working quite closely with all the small water utilities throughout the state.
Yeah, well, thank you. And speaking of small water utilities, Blake, you work around small systems up on the rim and elsewhere, both public and private, across northern Arizona. What are you seeing out there?
Hey, well, thank you again for the time. Happy to share some feedback. So our company actively operates and maintains about 1,500 service connections spread out across 5 systems. And then on top of that, we consult on a managerial level with about another dozen more. And so we have a pretty good pulse on what's going on, boots on the ground with the small systems. And there's an interesting dichotomy where you have to look at the business models that play with these water districts versus small private utility. A water district has the ability to raise their revenues and raise their rates to meet whatever threshold that they feel like is their actual cost. And so when you're seeing these districts not raise their cost, it's not typically, in our experience, they're trying to keep rates low. It's that they don't realize what the cost of service truly is. It's rare that we come to a district that's under 1,000 service connections that is including depreciation of their assets in their budget. And so on a cash basis, they're seeing themselves turn out money ahead year over year, but they're not accounting for the decline and the degradation of what's happening underground. And so when you start to look at that, what we find is typically 30 to 50% of a rate, 30 to 50% underfunding or underfunding their capital investment at any given time. On the private side of things, there's a different business model at play, and we've kind of seen something similar to what Commissioner Marquez Peterson shared, where there's private equity that's buying up a lot of these disadvantaged systems, or they've kind of fallen into hardship. But the root issue that we see with a lot of them is that there was a business model at play for a long time where the system was owned and operated by the same entity. And so when that was happening, you had a company like ours that in year one, they take over a system, and whether they get that on a tax lien from a developer or they purchase it at a discount themselves, they're now paying themselves a management fee, and they're able to draw off the profits of the asset base. And then on top of that, they're able to depreciate those assets against their income. And so it creates a really profitable business venture in that first year. Well, what happens is when you go on for 10, 20, 30 years of doing that and you're not reinvesting the capital back into the system, it just gets less and less and less. And so we're seeing systems that, their base rate is like $14 a month. And that's not even enough at this point to cover, basic repairs and operations, and much less being able to actually hire qualified staff when the time comes that there's an ownership transition. They're pretty reliant on that one entity. With that being said, we're seeing a lot of systems that are starting to get proactive, that are participating in some trainings locally, and starting to really look at what are our capital needs and how do we right the ship. We've had 2 systems in the past year that have raised rates for the first time in 30 years. And so that's kind of encouraging to see, a trend start to change.
Yeah, no, for sure. Joe, you manage a large public system in an urban area. What are you seeing down there in Tucson?
Thanks, Catherine. For those who aren't familiar, Metro Water, we're a domestic water improvement district. We primarily serve throughout unincorporated Pima County, and we have around 60,000 customers throughout 5 service areas throughout the county. So I certainly agree with what some of the statements my other panelists have made. I want to focus probably a little bit more on the reliability side of this, because like as Blake mentioned, not having a base rate high enough to be able to do your basic infrastructure maintenance really upends the whole ability to provide reliable water service. So one of the things that we saw is most of our service areas, except one, are essentially built out. And a lot of the municipal providers' capital improvements programs rely on a growth-based model, basically your connection fees, in order to fund your capital improvements program. So a couple years ago, we tried to shift away from a growth-based model to have a dedicated revenue stream for our capital improvements program or infrastructure rehabilitation fee. And while it certainly doesn't fund all of our capital needs, it funds a chunk of them. And in discussions with our customers, we got broad support, actually no negative feedback, on the importance of having this separate fee. So that way we're not having to try to focus on solely growth to be able to maintain our system. We're able to invest in our system outside of connection-based fees. On the affordability piece, I know Grant mentioned the median household income. We certainly use the handy tool that WIFA has out there, their rate dashboard, just so not in a vacuum planning. It's another external way that you're able to look at your rates when we go through each annual rate review to make sure that we're not trending in any direction that's not appropriate.
Interesting, yeah. But at the end of the day, a water system has to function adequately, right? If it's going to deliver safe, reliable water. And this just takes a lot of money, as you all mentioned, particularly in aging infrastructure. And our systems do continue to age. A fundamental challenge for all water providers is finding that balance between revenue adequacy and stability for the utility on one hand, but then concern about affordability for customers. And that is a really tough balance. How do you think about this relationship between revenue, stability, and affordability? Commissioner Marquez, we'll start out with you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll explain for maybe those on watching who don't realize how we tackle rate cases and rate increases as they occur. The water utility should have a plan in place. They will be working closely with our staff at the commission. They are, in many cases, spending that money in advance and then coming to us for cost recovery. As commissioners, we are determining that it's a prudent investment, that it's not overbuilt, that it's necessary. Sometimes you have some debate and discussion with our commission staff on different items. Some areas of our state are growing rapidly, like Maricopa and Queen Creek and other areas throughout the state, and we're seeing a lot of investment. In other places, it's pretty steady. So it's really very different depending on where you are throughout the state and the size of the utility, but it really comes down to that balance. Related to the smallest of our utilities, WIFA plays a key role, the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority, where we need those resources to help a lot of our utilities move along and be able to invest. Not all of them are familiar with it. At the commission, we have a small water ombudsman, and that role was created about, I think it was 2016 or 17, to really assist our smallest. We call them size D and E as we rate them. A's are the largest and so on, that can really handhold the water utility operators and making sure they have professional and technical expertise and that they can file those rate cases with us.
Very cool. And we're going to hear, I think, a little bit more about that ombudsman program in other questions. Joe, do you want to hop in, and then maybe Blake?
Sure, I'd love to. This question's obviously very close to our heart here because got to give a little history of our revenue stability journey that we made at Metro here. So around 11 years ago, I arrived at Metro Water the same time as our Chief Financial Officer, Diane Bracken. And at the time, our revenue stability, or what we call our fixed costs for our fixed revenue to cover our fixed costs, was in the upper 60%. That's better than some of the other providers, but it wasn't at the goal that we wanted to achieve. So Dan, she built a custom rate model with over 30 million calculations based on all historical rates, historical consumption information, and we were able to arrive that there was really a two-step we needed to do to achieve what our end state goal was, which was 90% revenue stability. We understood the concern also that some of the public would have as related to affordability or any type of rate shock. So what we did in year one was we increased our base rate by $5. That in of itself would be a death blow for any water provider. It would have been very unpopular. But at the same time, the very first tier of consumption, we reduced the cost per 1,000 gallons by $1. So it resulted in the average customer only having an 80-cent a month increase, while at the same time catapulting our revenue stability up to 83%. Interestingly enough, as we went out to our customers, our public, we didn't receive any negative feedback, not one negative comment, which is really surprising when you're talking rates, because we were able to educate and our customers understood. But that was only step one. And we knew we needed to do ultimately a two-step process. And as we were planning step two, we did get some feedback, more on inputs for some of our customers who were more on the lower consumption side, as it related to, let's say, customers who are 3,000 gallons or less. And what we did with our second step is we folded the first 3,000 gallons of consumption into the base rate. I know other providers call it a sustenance amount, and we used a similar term. And then we eliminated the first rate block, the first tier. So basically, tier two became tier one. That was only a 3.7% increase. But what that did is it acknowledged the customers that have been conserving water with having that amount that's in the base rate, and it moved our revenue stability to 90% of fixed cost recovery. To make sure that we weren't, again, operating in a vacuum, we had an external conservation organization take a look at our rates. They did an own study and also showed that we still were achieving our conservation goals because we still had the inverted block rate structure. That's why we stopped at 90%, because you can get 100% of revenue stability, but you're not having a conservation message at that point. So that was 9 years ago. And I always like to say proof's in the pudding when it comes to water affordability, because over the past 9 years, our average rate increase has been less than 3% a year. So if you accumulate that over, that's about 26, 27% increase. Other providers in the region, their average rate increase per year was about 6%. So that approaches 70%. So when you look at a 70% versus about a 27% over a 9-year period, obviously the steps we made for revenue stability not only ensured that we're getting the revenue for our capital planning, our water resource planning, but also substantially reduced the impact to our ratepayers' pocketbooks. So I would argue that yes, on a very short term, revenue stability and affordability could be at odds, but if you do the rate design correctly, certainly over the course of a number of years, that inversion flips and it's very positive on the affordability side.
Interesting. But in fairness, you run a pretty large system. So it's maybe a slightly different balance, Blake, for small systems across the state to find that sweet spot. What do you have some thoughts on this, on how we balance revenue stability and affordability, particularly for these small systems?
Yeah, we see similar stuff to what Joel's describing, but I feel like the districts that we interact with, especially, take sophisticated analysis that uh, Tucson Metro Water or these larger entities are doing, then they try to apply it to these small systems that they operate without really doing the in-depth analysis that Joe is talking about. And so we'll see uh, basically they'll go for a rate increase, but then they feel bad about doing the rate increase, so they'll add another $1,000 onto that included minimum surcharge, and all of a sudden, uh, their base rate is getting up into the $35 to $40, but they're giving away the first 5,000 gallons of water for free. And so it's like they're increasing rates, but they're not really increasing it. They're just giving more water away every time they go about it. But I think that the heart of how I try to approach this with systems is you have to set up your system to be sustainable, and so the cost of service is the cost of service ultimately. The affordability question is a separate issue that you then have to address once you've reached that sustainable standpoint. But your rates have to be able to generate enough revenue to be able to replace, whether that's 1% of your lines a year or 2% of your lines a year. I mean, I don't see that with a lot of systems where over a period of a decade, 10% of the lineal foot of their pipelines are getting replaced, much less their wells and their tanks and everything else. And so um, they have to be thinking ahead, and especially in a state like Arizona, where we don't have systems that have been around for 120 years like you see on the East Coast. We're a new state, and so a lot of this development has happened in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And so this wave starts to build where the asset life is reaching its end, but there hasn't been the money set aside or reinvested back into it. So.
And can you, Blake, I'm going to stay on you for a second. Can you talk a little bit just in terms of process, some of the issues and obstacles that the small private water systems face when trying to change rates? And then we'll ask the commissioner to weigh in on that as well.
I think that first, there's a lot of good things that have came out. I'd like to just acknowledge the commission's small ombudsman's office. They're great to work with. We think really highly of them. A big issue for the systems is not putting the capital back into the system over a period of decades. And so when they go to increase rates, um, the business model isn't set up that you get the money from rates to then go and invest. You invest that money first, and then you recover it through the rates. And so if people don't have that kind of training or forward thinking mentality, uh, it ends up kind of compounding on itself over a long period of time. And then we have to go through just what you described. We had a system just a couple of years ago that had to go through an emergency rate increase of like 200% because there just hadn't been anything done for decades and the system was in disrepair and they just needed money right away.
Yeah, it's really tough, and that was one of the major findings of our report, is that the water rates of these small rural systems are older, right, than the water rates of the larger systems in the urban systems, because
Well,
it can be a challenge to update those rates. So, oh, I'm sorry, were you about to say something?
well, I was just gonna say, I don't think Grant hit on it, but was that direct correlation. I really appreciated that part of your study where it said it compared the age of the rates and the cost of the water to compliance. And there's a direct correlation between the two. And so the systems that are charging more and looking at their rates regularly have a higher compliance threshold. They're providing, safer water.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Thanks for
Mhm.
bringing that up. Commissioner, I know you've done a lot of work on this issue, and the commission has taken some really significant steps to make the process a little bit easier for these small systems. Can you highlight some of those for us?
No,
And,
sure.
and maybe you could talk about some things that you would also like to accomplish.
Yeah, I think from a commission perspective, we're trying to take a common sense approach to this issue. 340 plus utilities. We've got, half a dozen very large companies. The remainder tend to be mom and pop, D and E size as we define them. So how do we ensure they have a regular pattern of rate cases before us? One, it provides that compliance oversight, that regulatory oversight, but it also means we're less likely to see an emergency rate case pop before us where wells are failing or investment hasn't been made and we're at an emergency situation and you see really high rate increases. So we've got a couple different tools we put in place. The small water ombudsman position that I mentioned previously, Britton Baxter has been a great leader in that regard, doing work with all the different small water utilities and working closely with ADEQ and ADWR to ensure that we're all in compliance and that we're aware of where folks are at. We've also encouraged acquisitions where it makes sense. If a company lacks the professional and technical expertise to be operating their system, if Grandpa started this when he was, had a large development and it's come down through the generations and there's not someone there who really has that expertise, and unfortunately that exists a lot throughout Arizona, we are encouraging some of the larger utilities to acquire them if that makes sense, and it's a win-win for both sides. We've also streamlined the rate cases. We have rate cases that come in, sometimes handwritten, depending on the size of the utilities. And so we've worked really hard in 2021 to put streamlined rate cases in place where we, for the smaller utilities, really highlighted the most important data that they need to bring to us. We're taking that a step further in this next year where we're going to be creating online templates where folks can input their information online and it'll feed into our systems. I think that'll even take us to another spot, and that'll also help promote gradualism, because if it's easier to do the rate case, if it's not such a huge endeavor, you're not having to pay a lot of legal fees to do so, especially the smaller the water utility, you're more likely to come in to see us hopefully every 5-6 years or something in that with that pattern, and you'll have more gradual impact to your customers rather than some rate shock that occurs. We also passed an acquisition premium, so a incentive tool for larger utilities or utilities throughout the state to look at some of the smaller utilities for acquisition. And I wrote down the note, since 2016, we've had over 70 utilities acquired with that premium. Always improvements that can be made. If there are folks listening to this webinar now and they have ideas about policy changes, they're welcome to reach out to me or other commissioners to talk more about that, because we're very focused on the water industry is so different than the electricity industry, the gas, and others that we're working with. And there's so many small players. We need to make sure that, we've got that reliability and affordability in place.
Absolutely. And I know EPA has been trying to work on consolidation for many years, and it's been really difficult to achieve successes. So it's nice to hear that we've got something right here in Arizona.
And I'll add too, Catherine, if you layer on the incredible growth that Arizona is seeing, we're one of the fastest growing states in the country. Maricopa County is, I always call it, on fire, right? There's so much going on there and so much, we need to really balance reliability with growth and have those coming into the state pay for that new growth and infrastructure. That's probably a whole other research paper.
For sure. Joe, I made it out that because you run a larger system, things are maybe easier for you, but you might disagree with that when it comes time to increase rates. That is certainly a pain that is shared by everyone, not just the small systems. Do you want to talk about the public process a little bit and some of the challenges?
Certainly. I do want to start by saying Blake made a really good statement on the previous question that each provider has their own unique needs and challenges. Yes, there's some parallels, but absolutely you have to take that customized approach. I mentioned that our CFO made a custom rate model, and that's based on our data. That's not based on other people's data. So you could not take that and plug and play that anywhere else, but it's very applicable and highly accurate for what our needs are. Probably the largest thing that applies to all water providers, though, when you're going out for any rate case, whether it's through the commission, whether it's through a public or private side, is transparency. So being able to justify the need for rates and then explain to your customers where that additional revenue is going. It's one thing to say we need to do an X% increase and then send out all the rate inserts, but you need to go along with that to explain where that revenue is going to go, what it's going to be invested in, whether it's infrastructure, specific initiatives, et cetera. Because otherwise, in the absence of that, you're basically creating an arena to where customers will make assumptions of this is maybe just going to result in higher paying staff or a wasting of these resources, et cetera. The other thing that we found has been much more efficient because even in a public entity doing a rate hearing and going through the process, it takes an extensive amount of work. So a few years back, we started doing multi-year rate cases or rate approvals through our board of directors. So we do a 3-year rates, and then if it was needed, we do an annual look to see if there's an adjustment. But so far, when we take a 3-year package, that's then approved at one point, and then those other percent increases kick in on the beginning of the fiscal year. That's better, I feel, for the public's perspective because we're able to plan, budget, we're able to communicate with them, and also it helps better planning on our capital improvements program, water resources, and other initiatives. But again, at the end of the day, if you don't have the transparency and the trust, all the other stuff will just fall apart when you take it to your public.
Interesting. So people talk a lot about customer assistance programs, and certainly customer assistance programs can help mitigate affordability concerns, but they're often difficult to implement. And unless you're able to secure funding from some outside source, like a grant or nonprofit or something like that, they generally entail subsidies from one customer class to another. How should we be thinking about this in this context? I'll let any of you jump in. Who wants to take that one first?
I'll start if my fellow panelists are okay with that. I'll put a plug in here for LIWAP, the Low Income Water Assistance Program. Federally funded, we had dollars to provide through our various county centers that assist low-income families. That was very helpful during COVID. It has since run out. I was at a recent energy-related conference where LIWAP was brought up, and talk of, could we reconsider and extend LIHEAP, the program that's for electricity, and include also water utilities. So that still needs work. I think there is there's a lot of interest from commissioners across the nation in supporting LIWAP and federal assistance programs, because it is hard. In our state, what are we, 340, most of them small water utilities? They can't stand up their own low-income program typically. And sometimes there are utility assistance programs, but it's all focused on electricity. We also wanted to make sure that those that are funding or paying their bills, they're not being subsidized by others that are also seeing rate increases. And so that's important to us at the commission to make sure that we aren't subsidizing one customer with another customer. And that applies to all the utilities we work with, but certainly in water also. And I'll stop there and see what else the other panelists want to add.
I'll jump in just with another perspective to add on to what the commissioner said. Depending on the size of the organization, you certainly might not have your own low income program. But the challenge that I've seen is if entities try to have their customer service reps be that qualification review aspect, because like our CSRs all throughout the industry, they're great at working with turning on water service, billing, et cetera. But when it comes with trying to foist on them the responsibilities to do income review, et cetera, that's where I think it's a challenge. And then you can create a potential tension between customers of, is a portion of the revenue being paid for one customer going to another, and if there hasn't been an appropriate review. That's why the low-income programs that I've seen that have been successful is there's an independent agency that does that verification review, perhaps for already another low-income program. So then pairing onto that qualification criteria is much more efficient than trying to have a water utility arrive at their own.
Interesting. I don't know. Yeah, Blake, what do you see a lot of customer assistance programs in Northern Arizona?
I see the utilities rates are the customer assistance program typically, that the rates are being kept artificially low to try to address that. And so what we talk about with our systems is a couple of things. People talk about, we always kind of seem to go back to people on a fixed income, and are our rates going up like people on a fixed income are? Social Security has an increase every single year. Are your rates keeping up with those cost of living adjustments that we're seeing? The other thing is, and I think Joe, you're dead on, is it's not the role of the customer service to have to go and vet everybody. And that gets exponentially tougher when you're in a small community. A lot of times we see there's they're fairly homogenous as far as income goes, but you don't want to go to your neighbor who might be a volunteer board member and say, well, this is my income status, that sort of thing. And so the vetting process gets hard, but I agree entirely with Joe's point too. There's already agencies within the state and within the federal government that are basically saying people are eligible for SNAP benefits or WIC or these different programs. And we should have streamlined processes where you can take eligibility in one program and apply it to the other. And while I agree with what the commissioner says, I do think that there is some need to subsidize to some extent because your rates have to be sufficient. And the people who are in the highest income brackets are not going to be as affected disproportionately as people who are retired on a fixed income. Now, I don't think that that should be the go-to solution or it should be heavily subsidized. But some sort of reduction in the bill, I think, is beneficial because the economic impact of my water utility failing is far greater than me having a 10% additional rate compared to, somebody else.
Well said. And, it's back to tough balances, right? It's really hard to find that. Yeah, well said. Many people say that water is too cheap in our arid state. I hear that a lot. If it were more expensive, then people would use less. But of course, that impacts affordability. So I wonder if any of our panelists have thoughts on that balance as well.
Sure, Catherine, I'll jump in quick here. Yes, I do believe water is certainly inexpensive when you compare it to any other utility short of natural gas in the summer. But many providers that I'm aware of, and I know we at Metro have the inverted block rate structure. So you do get that price inelasticity aspect to where the more water you use, the higher you're paying on a block rate. So you're promoting conservation because we see that anytime increases occur in some of the upper blocks, many people fall out of those blocks and reduce their consumption appropriately. But you still have the need to address that basic sustenance amount. That's why not just what's folded into your base rate, but that first tier of consumption needs to be affordable. And then you can have those conservation pressures going up from there. So I think you can address the issue about cost of water being what really is appropriate on some of those other upper blocks. But you also have to take a step back and ensure at the end of the day that you're looking at it from a cost of service perspective and not solely a conservation penalty is what I kind of hear often used in the industry.
And I'll just add to that, Catherine, that most people realize when we handle rate cases, we're actually doing rate design at the commission. So with so many different utilities and different structures, I would say, or different customer bases, you've got areas of the state where there are a lot of snowbird, right? Temporary housing. You've got others that we really should be promoting conservation, large rolling grass, and I live in Tucson and we embrace native plants down here. So it's a little different than different parts of the state, areas where there's a lot of agricultural use. And so, I think each utility we really tackle in terms of what rate design makes the most sense. And I think the rates really, should be related to the capital investment that's being made. I wouldn't want to unnaturally inflate rates because in some way to press conservation. But I also mentioned that I'm pretty involved in NARUC, which is our National Association for Commissioners. And so we talk to other state commissioners. Texas, I believe, has 700 water utilities their commission regulates. And it varies state by state. Some commissions don't regulate water. But I think learning from others and understanding their water situations or drought conditions or whatever might be happening in their states is also very helpful.
For sure. Blake, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I think that you guys touched on this, but the state is not, the water issues across the state are not all the same. And so what's happening in Phoenix is not what we're experiencing up here in Pine Top, which is not what Payson's experiencing between the two. There's the access to water and the availability of those sources vary pretty extensively. With that being said, Bluefield Research just came out with a paper on water rates and affordability that looks at the whole national wide trend. And it was interesting to note that the city of Phoenix was the cheapest water for any metropolitan in the study. And so I think that there's a lot we should be thinking ahead about the amount of development that's taking place that's been, just like Joe was saying, either funding the capital investment and expanding capacity of sources, or we haven't been accounting for the cost of replacing that stuff that the developers paid for in the first place. And so we should be thinking about it now proactively, so we're not in a situation like they are in the East Coast where they're having to replace these really outdated lines. So that's all I have on.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you're right, those geographical differences and climate differences and water availability differences are really important in our state, for sure. There is often strong pushback, as you guys all know, when a water provider tries to increase rates, but really, one of the findings of our study is that most families pay far less for tap water than for cell phone service or cable or internet or these other utilities. Given that that's the case, why do we continue to see this pushback? What are your thoughts on how the water service stacks up against these other services as well?
Sure, I'll jump in, Catherine. So I used to be one of those ones, maybe about 10 years back, that I maybe would stop short of saying I vilified cell phone service compared to people paying their water bill. And the reason I pivoted on that is now people's income streams is so much integral tied to their cell phone service as it relates to the gig economy, et cetera. So I found what's more effective is not to talk about what people are paying for their other utilities, but to go back to the value of water. There's something I do at all my rate hearings I love, and it's two things. One, I'll hand up a bottle, 1 liter bottle, and talk about the cost of that. And then I'll put a picture of somebody standing next to a 55-gallon drum, and those drums just keep going across until there's 1,000 gallons. And I talk about the equivalency of cost there. But the one that really drives it home is pretty close. 1 penny is about 2 gallons of water. So at all of my rate hearings and information meetings, I'll have a nice jar of shiny pennies. And I'll go around and I'll give each one of our customers a penny and say, allow me to buy you 2 gallons of water. I know it's corny, but as they're holding that shiny penny, they're thinking that's 2 gallons of water. It immediately impresses on them the value of water. And then last thing is, above the drinking fountain in the lobby, we obviously have a free sample sign because that tells them that water is actually valuable. It's not free. So I think when you get people to change their thought process on water has this distinct value and it's delivered to my house at 2 in the morning as opposed to me paying a quarter to go drive to a fill station and spill it in the back of my vehicle, that is how you get through to customers as opposed to trying to compare and contrast other utilities. Even though you're absolutely right on the data, that won't really resonate with the customers. We found that we've had a great success in interacting and sharing those type of anecdotes, though we might have to switch from pennies to nickels with pennies going away.
I love that. Commissioner Blake, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think Joe's right on, and I might have to steal some of those ideas, Joe.
Yeah.
That's really good visual. I was going to respond with, I don't think customers truly think about where the water comes from or even their electricity, right? If we always talk about you flip the switch on the wall and you just want it to turn on and you want to turn the tap and it's got to be good quality water and it just be there. And so oftentimes, because I have to campaign for the position I'm in, I'm talking to rooms that are not technical or experts in this area. I'm talking to rotaries and chambers throughout the state, and they just tell me, just don't increase my rates. Just,
Yeah.
you got my support. Don't. And I'm like, that's not realistic. What happens if we don't, raise rates ever? Let's unpack that. Let's understand it. And I like your visual though, Joe. I think it's really just communicating and being transparent with the customers so they realize the additional investment that's needed to ensure that we have reliability.
For sure. Blake?
Joe, I'm going to steal that as well. I like that a lot. I often remind our boards that for me, I've got 3 kids. I've got a 7, 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And if I take them all out to McDonald's these days, if we get meals and Happy Meals for everybody, it's about $50. I mean, it's a lunch, and that's just going out for fast food. These are. It's important to realize that our utilities are basically what separate us from the first world countries from a third world country. There are people who have to carry water on their back, and it's a lot more than 4 hours a month that they're trying to just bring, jugs of water around. And so we need to make sure our customers realize from a public communication standpoint what the value of service is and what the value of water is. 4,000 gallons is like 33,000 pounds. And so they're having a liquid lifted under pressure, sterile and ready to consume at any time that they want it. And they can have as much as they want. That's a really cheap service and unlike really anything else.
Very well said. I think we'll switch over real quick. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions and from the audience, and Grant is going to take us through some of those.
Great. Yeah, we received a number of questions from the audience, so thank you for those. The first one is, how do you expect rates to change because of some new regulations for things like PFAS or the need to acquire new water supplies? Feel free, anybody can jump in on that.
I'll jump on the PFAS side because it's a challenge that we, like other providers, have been dealing with. We've been fortunate that we've been able to keep rates low as a result of that because there's been other funding available, whether it was through WIFA, through BIL, etc. We were able to obtain different grants, and I call it non-ratepayer revenue, to be able to address the majority of those needs with upgrades of treatment. But in an environment where maybe some of the federal funding or any of the state revolving funds maybe decrease, that would ultimately certainly have pressures on future rate cases.
Yeah, and I'll support what Joe said. I think this is an issue that's looming for water utilities across the nation. How do we afford the treatment that is needed for PFAS as it's, discovered in different parts of the nation, much less Arizona, and especially the smallest water utilities? How are we going to tackle that? I think we're still trying to determine what this means. The closest thing I can relate it to is how the commission and the industry handled the arsenic issue years ago. I wasn't on the commission then, but I've certainly been told a lot about that. But I think this is still something we're working out.
I would add to that, there's the immediate capital cost, which is huge, and then there's also the long-term operational cost for your small systems. And so small system, when you get down below 500 service connections, only requires somebody on site legally at minimum of once a month. When you start adding these treatment processes, you're going to have staff there a lot more regularly, and especially if they're more advanced treatment processes. And so there's and that those man hours, if you're spreading that out over a customer base of 100 people versus 1,000 or 10,000, gets exponentially larger. I think, Joe, you hit on it, and we should kind of throw the plug out there, but WIFA is just such a great resource, especially if there's any small systems listening. They have grants, forgivable principal loans that are available for disadvantaged systems or dealing with public health emergencies. And then the state also just received a bunch of funding for dealing with these new emerging contaminants. It's still, been kind of shaky in the past few months as far as how that's all going to play out. But as of right now, all that funding's there and available and should be used. So.
Great, thank you all. Do you find that there is a measurable relationship between a rate increase and in the following 3, 6, 9 months in the various terms, and a relationship between delinquencies and service shutoffs? Or do those things relatively stay constant depending upon the size of the rate change?
I'll add that I've not seen that correlation. I know during COVID, it was important to us to make sure we passed disconnection rules at the commission that probably received more media attention for electricity and so on. But certainly we're being very careful because folks were really struggling during COVID and beyond. But I've not seen data that supports that correlation. And we try to be, of course, very careful with rate increases and make sure they're as gradual as possible. So I'll see if my fellow panelists have anything to add.
Yeah, well, I agree with the commissioner. We've not seen direct data to support that. If anything, in some prior years, I've seen delinquencies increase after the holidays because people maybe overexpose themselves on gifts, etc. So we can see that as it rolls into February, March. But as long as you're transparent and communicating what those increases are, and if there are affordable increases, we've not seen the spike in delinquencies.
I would concur. I don't want to belabor time, so we can hit all the questions, but yeah, that's been our experience as well.
Great. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more, depending upon the level of detail. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, definitely at least one.
Great. We have a question that is based on, so given the variety of rates between tribal systems in the state and non-tribal systems, and what steps can better be taken to support tribal water systems in balancing the need for rate adjustments with the goal of ensuring that those communities have access to affordable water while still updating their systems? So is there an opportunity that any of you see to support tribal systems in doing this balance as well?
I think there's certainly an opportunity for more communication. I think it's very siloed. I think we in the private water utility space are kind of do our thing, and we have a lot of conferences, and we have the WUA, the Water Utility Association of Arizona, and other organizations. The tribal entities I don't see engaging as much, and I think maybe we could all be learning from one another and sharing best practices if we had more engagement.
Great. So I suppose then there's a few questions, unless anybody else had anything to add on that topic. I think a good one to end on, there was a few different questions that all kind of focus on the same idea, and it's sort of, what can I do? What is the individual involvement? There's some about what can I do to keep, or what can an individual ratepayer do to keep their rates affordable, or what can an individual do to support local water policy reform, et cetera. People are curious what their role in this is individually and how they can get involved.
Sure, I'll jump in. One of the initiatives that we're in the process of accomplishing is having a customer portal for customers to be able to see the real-time water usage. It's been a goal I've wanted to have done for about 10 years or so. Many of our staff have been working on that. And what that will do is hopefully enable the data and the tools within our customers' fingertips to be able to real-time see what their usage is, what their trends are, as well as to rapidly move on any leaks, et cetera. And beyond taking that proactive approach on leaks, et cetera, I think getting more involved with your local water provider, whether it's attending board meetings, public meetings, et cetera, because I find the customers that do that, they have a greater insight and intuitive nature on what's going on, not just about the rates, but about their usage profiles. But again, that's an active step that people would need to take.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that smart meters, not every utility has them. That's an investment in and of itself, but they're a great tool when you've got them and you can look on your phone and see usage and so on. I see a lot of utilities across the state really moving towards the purple pipe, right, as toilet to tap or whatever you want to, advanced water purification. I think I heard it called the other day. So that you see a lot of activity, but that's in some of the newer home development. I think if you're in a new home development, if you've got something like that, taking advantage of support, and that's really great for conservation, and you're fueling purified water into common areas. And you've heard communities like the city of Phoenix, and I think San Diego and LA and others are already utilizing it to the tap. So I think you're going to see a lot of direction in that regard. But my best advice to folks is always just pay attention. If you don't have a smart meter, it's really understanding why your water usage might be increasing dramatically, especially in the hottest times of the summer. Not a lot. We get complaints at the commission when people don't see that correlation between really high water use or electricity use in the summer as compared to other times of the year, and why that's impacted their rates.
I would say encourage your boards for the small systems out there to raise rates regularly and appropriately, because that's when you really have the rate shock is coming in. If you're doing small incremental increases, it adds up to a lot over time, but it's easier to manage and fit into your budget. The other thing is, for small systems, technology in the past 10 years has gotten a lot more accessible, and the small scale of these 100 to 500 service connection systems allows technology like advanced metering that takes Joe a decade. For us, we can do it in a few months to be able to roll that out and provide customers access. Same with SCADA. That was a $100,000, $200,000 hardware and software in the early part of my career. Now it's $3,500 for a module system to put on just a simple well and tank. All of that can help reduce labor costs, and so there's ways to start bringing technology and bringing these systems into the 21st century.
Very cool. Yeah, and I'll, because you guys all brought up smart meters, I'll give another shout out to WIFA, because a lot of their funding in their last round for conservation went to AMI and smart meters, which is really cool. Thank you all very much for participating today. It was an amazing discussion. We're really grateful for your time. I'll say to the audience, please watch your email inbox for a link to a recording of this webinar and the tap water affordability report itself. And please share with anyone else who you think might be interested in this topic. Tune in on March 19th for another installment of the Arizona Water Blueprint Office Hours, where we answer questions about how to use the blueprint to learn about water resources and policy in our state. Once again, thanks to our sponsors, the Arizona Water Infrastructure Finance Authority and the Arizona Water Innovation Initiative. And one last thank you to our panelists who did a fantastic job. Have a nice day.
Thanks, everybody.